Good morning and welcome to Palm Sunday. We have finally arrived and the weather has arrived with us. It looks like it's going to be another beautiful day. As we begin this week, I want to kind of start where we left off last week. You will remember in talking about Mary Magdalene, we also did a little study of Da Vinci's Last Supper. But I feel like I want to update that study. So let's look at Da Vinci's Last Supper in the era of social distancing, where all of the disciples and Mary Magdalene included have come by Zoom. Thanks to David Overend for this slide. Let's start though, seriously, where we usually do in saying this verse from the 46th Psalm. I will say the verse and invite you to repeat what I have said. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. I want to ask a rhetorical question. Why do you think the resurrected Jesus appeared to his friends? If after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to his disciples, why did he do that? What purpose was he serving? Thomas Keating offers one answer. In the garden of the resurrection, the full revelation of the mystery of Christ is unveiled, which is to say that the teaching, the example, the modeling that Jesus had provided for his disciples all of his life, and indeed from the cross, was not complete until he appeared as the risen Christ, as if it were the last thing they needed, some last lesson that they needed to learn. Who do you say that I am? Earlier in Jesus's ministry, he gathered disciples around him and he asked, "Who do they say that I am?" Various answers were proposed. And then Jesus said, "Yes, but who do you say that I am?" Peter offered the right answer, the Messiah. But then we had to learn what that meant. What does the Messiah mean? And I think we get a vivid example of that on Palm Sunday, where Jesus marches into Jerusalem. The crowds are waving their palms and shouting, "Hosanna." And then we enter into Holy Week, which will include Maundy Thursday and Good Friday, all before Easter, as if we were loving the right person, but maybe for the wrong reasons. Now, Cynthia Bourgeot answers our question by suggesting that the wisdom walk with Jesus is at every step of the way a recognition drama. Now, what she means by this is that the way we see Jesus tells us something about ourselves, that the part of us that sees Jesus, that answers the question, "Who do you think I am?" is the part of us that is growing, and that our calling, our journey of faith, is to go deeper and deeper into ourselves and thereby approach God who is there. And Jesus is there with us every step of the way, giving us what we need in order to grow, in order to draw nearer to God. This is what Jesus was doing with his disciples all of his life and ministry. And this is what Jesus is doing with his disciples as he appears as a resurrected Jesus. Jesus appears 4 times in the Gospels. The first is at the tomb early on Sunday morning. The second in Jerusalem in the upper room. The third on the road to Emmaus. And the fourth by the Sea of Tiberias. We will talk about each of these as we explore the question, who do you say that I am? Let's start at the tomb early on Easter Sunday. And as I've noted here, this scene with Mary Magdalene has been recorded in all 4 Gospels, the only resurrection appearance that appears in all 4 Gospels. I like this version of this scene where Jesus appears as the gardener with that wonderful big straw hat. Mary Magdalene, you will remember, does not recognize him. She thinks he is the gardener. And then when he calls her by name, when he says, Mary, that's when she recognizes him. That's when that part of her, which she has already given to him, is triggered, is made to come alive. She sees that it is him. She goes to hug him, and he stops her. He tells her not to cling to him. Now, Thomas Keating takes this scene of Jesus and Mary Magdalene and treats it as if it is a garden scene, a parallel to the Garden of Eden scenes in Genesis. He says that the interaction between Jesus and Mary Magdalene goes through 3 stages or levels, each of which marks a stage or level in the spiritual journey, a stage or a level in our path to transformed consciousness. The first level is simply the experience of being loved by God. Mary Magdalene had experienced this moment, this feeling during Jesus's life, and it all comes back to her like a rushing wave when he calls her by name. The second level is the capacity to see all things in God. It is as if knowing that you are loved by God then brings forth from you the capacity to love God. And in loving God, you are able to see that all things are in God. All things live in a life of God. And the third level, which is sometimes called divine union or resting in God, is the awareness of God giving himself in and through all things. We have talked about this experience, sometimes using the term unitive experience. Think about Thomas Merton, for example, and his experience in Louisville on that street corner, in which he suddenly felt that he loved everybody there. They were all children of God, as if they were all aspen trees growing out of the same root structure, as if they were all grounded in the same earth and being. So I wonder, when have you experienced being loved? When have you been aware that you were truly loved? I want you to take 2 minutes and try to recall these experiences of being loved. I invite you to come back from that reflection. But I hope you have made a couple of notes or had a chance to talk with each other. Those experiences, I think, come in many forms, and they are, at least for me, wonderful to remember. So on that base, that first level of knowing what it's like to be loved by God, let's move to Jerusalem, or we're still in Jerusalem, but let's move to the upper room. You will remember that the disciples gathered in the upper room, locking the door in fear of the authorities. And then Jesus appeared to them, told them to be at peace. But Thomas wasn't there. Thomas was somewhere else. 8 days later, Jesus came to that same upper room a second time. This time, Thomas was there. But in the first meeting, when Thomas realized what had happened, or at least when he came and he realized what had happened, he said, "Unless I see the mark of his nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." Now, we have called him Doubting Thomas in the tradition over the years, as if what was really going on was his simply not believing that Jesus had risen from the dead. But I wonder if more was going on than that, if more was happening to Thomas than simply disbelief. Let's look at some paintings of Thomas. Here you see Thomas looking in amazement and falling before Jesus. And here you see what is probably the most popular and well-known of these scenes by Caravaggio, where with its particularly graphic representation of the doubting Thomas inspecting Jesus's wounds. But what was Thomas thinking? What was really going on with Thomas? I like this cartoon, which I think provides a pretty good explanation, actually, of what Thomas may have been thinking. In that first balloon, we have the Apostle Thomas. "All I'm saying," he says, "is that we don't call Peter denying Peter or Mark runaway naked Mark. Why should I be saddled with this title?" The response is, "I see your point, Thomas, but really, it's time to move on." I like that comic, but I think it gets to something really true. One of the things that might have been going on with Thomas, one of the things he might have been thinking, is that he had been left out. I mean, why did Jesus decide to come to that meeting where he was absent instead of another meeting where he might have been present? Why were the other disciples enraptured by the joy of seeing the risen Christ while he had been deprived of that experience? It reminds me of Adam and Eve, again, the parallels with the Garden of Eden, when they began to come to some sense of themselves as being separate from God, some self-consciousness, how they hid from God. Do you remember that part of the story? They go into the woods and they hide from God. So I'm wondering, when have you been called out of the woods of your darker emotions, like Thomas was, by Jesus, to experience the joy that those around you were feeling? In other words, when have you been Thomas? When have you been called out of the woods to experience the joy of being with God? Take 2 minutes and think about this question. I invite you to wrap up that reflection. But before we move on, I want you to get a sense of those first two levels of the transformation experience that Keating described. A sense how in your own lives you have experienced being loved by God, and how your response to that experience might have been able to see God in the world. The idea of being loved or forgiven on the front end, leading to your being more alive on the back end. Because I think this is what Jesus was doing in each of these resurrection appearances. I think Jesus in his resurrected body was appearing to the disciples and giving them what they needed to take the next step on that path of transformation. That's why they don't recognize him right away. It's because he's appearing to them in a different form. Whether you think that's an eternal form or a resurrected body as described by Paul is not important. It's not as important to me as the idea that he was appearing to them differently. He wasn't talking to them, giving them principles or proofs or things to believe in their heads. He was engaging them experientially. He was going to a deeper part of them. We're going to get a sense of this, I think, maybe even more explicitly than before, in the story of the road to Emmaus. You remember the story. There are two disciples who are walking down the road to Emmaus, which means, of course, they are walking away from Jerusalem. They are leaving their hopes and dreams. They, like Peter, believed that Jesus was the Messiah that was to liberate Israel from the Roman Empire, was to free the people, to guide them in their nationalistic expectations. And all of those hopes and dreams were dashed on the cross. The ministry, the messiahship that they thought Jesus had been a failure. And I suspect they believed their time had been wasted. So there they were, heads down, walking on a dusty road back to Emmaus, when a stranger appears. As has been true in the other stories, they don't recognize the stranger in Jesus. He is assuming a different form. He talks to them. They at first think he's just ignorant, not understanding what has happened, and more importantly, perhaps the import of what has happened. And then Jesus begins to explain the scriptures to them. He begins to open their hearts while they are on the road. Later, when Jesus is gone and they have recognized him as Jesus, one of the marks that they remember is that Jesus opened their hearts. They described it as a burning. Were our hearts not burning on the road when Jesus was explaining the scriptures to us? Now, haven't you wondered what it was that Jesus really said? Aren't you curious what Jesus described that allowed them suddenly to understand this Bible that I at least don't understand very well, suddenly makes sense? Well, I don't know exactly, of course, but I suspect that what Jesus described was what the true Messiah was. I suspect that Jesus, like the early Christians, went back to Isaiah, to the suffering servant, and showed what the Messiah really was, how the Messiah would in fact liberate God's people, and how that would play out in weakness and not in strength, how that would result in an inner journey of transformation and not an outer external politically victory, how the freedom and liberation that the people of God would experience and live into would be something that emerged out of them and not something that simply defeated an enemy outside of them. As they get near Emmaus, The two disciples invite Jesus to come into their homes, and Jesus does. Have you ever wondered what Jesus would have done had they not asked him to come into their homes? I suspect that Jesus might have just kept on walking down the road, not because he deemed them to be failures, but because they weren't ready for the next step in that journey of transformation. I believe that God is always with us, but sometimes we have to do the work to make ourselves ready to realize and accept the presence of God. I've talked before about the wonderful story of the poet I like, Ruth Stone, who says that she is often outside. She lives in Maine, so you can imagine her outside in the summer on a beautiful day, maybe gardening or otherwise walking. And she will know somehow in her being that a poem is coming. She says it'll come over the hills and she'll see it. And when she does, she has to run back to her house to get a pencil and paper to write it down. Because if she doesn't write it down when it finally arrives, it'll keep on going. She describes one moment when she had to write the poem down backwards, as if she had grabbed it by the tail as it was leaving, and she had to transcribe it in reverse. But here's the part I like. If I don't do this, she says, that poem will keep on going, looking for another poet. Sometimes we have to do the work to be ready. God is always present. Jesus is there to give us what we need, but sometimes we have to do the work to get ready. We were hoping, they said, that he would be the one who would set Israel free. And he is, he was, he will be, but maybe not in the way they wanted, and maybe for us, not always in the way we want either. So back to us, back to our lives. I want you to take a couple of minutes and think about this question. When have you realized that your upbringing, education, life experience, as good and excellent as they were, nevertheless prevented you from recognizing the truth about the presence of God in another person? Now, before I send you into this meditation, I want to give you my own answer to this question, one that I will always remember. It has to do with sexual orientation. I was raised in a very liberal household, but racial integration was the issue that we addressed in my childhood, and sexual orientation came much later. I didn't understand it, and I couldn't really make sense of it based on my life experience. But once I met some people that I knew that I loved already and learned that they were gay or lesbians or transgendered, I had to look at the whole issue differently. I didn't think myself into a different position. I already loved them, and that gave me a different perspective from which to think about that position. So your answer to this doesn't have to be one of the social litmus tests of the day. It can be very, very different. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. When are we just not able to hear the truth until the truth presents itself to us, incarnated in the spirit of another person? I invite you back from that reflection. And let's move to the last of the resurrection appearances. But before we start this discussion, I want you to know that there'll be a question and answer session following. So be thinking now about questions you might like to ask. And if you think you're sitting on one but don't really want to ask it, I want to suggest to you that there are several more of us who probably have the same question. And if you ask it, you'll be doing a service to the rest of us. All right, let's look at the last resurrection appearance. This, of course, happens on the beach at the Sea of Tiberias, which is sometimes referred to as a lake. The disciples had been told to go back to Galilee, and there they would see Jesus, but they hadn't really seen anything yet. So they wind up going fishing because, of course, they are fishermen. They go out on the sea one night. They go, I imagine, to all the places they normally go, and they catch nothing. They are out all night and have caught nothing. And then as they're coming back in, as the night ends and the morning is beginning to dawn, they see the outline of a figure on the beach. And that figure suggests that they cast the net on the other side of the boat. This would be a lot like somebody walking up on the bank and telling you to fish that hole again that you have just fished, knowing that there's nothing in it. But somehow they do anyway. And they catch a lot of fish, 153 fish, in fact. Now, what does that mean? You know how numbers are in the Bible. 3 means something. 4 means something, 7 means something, 12 means something, 40 means something. What do you think 153 means? Well, here's the answer. In the first frame, one character says to the other, 153. It's weird, isn't it? Such an exact number. The other answers, yeah, okay, so excitedly, the first character says, well, reversed, it's 351. Get it? That's 3, the Trinity, and Area 51. What? The other responds. Roswell, the first character says. So there you go. Everything you ever wondered about 153 answered right here, old-fashioned Sunday school. Back to our story. I love that Jesus told them to throw the net over the other side of the boat. I suspect that this has been a time-honored experience of the presence of Jesus, Christ, or God. What you were doing seemed to generate nothing but dryness and disappointment. And doing it in the presence of Jesus, making a small change without changing who you are or where you are, somehow yields a very rich and abundant catch. But let's go to the beach, because after that, after they sift through, find the good fish, they sit around the fire and have breakfast. And this, of course, is just another example of how a meal speaks to community and belonging in ways that words never can. There's something about sitting around the dinner table or a campfire or the Eucharist, which reminds us that we belong, that the presence of God is there, the hub of the wheel on which we are all just spokes. And that, I believe, is what happens to those disciples on that beach in the presence of Jesus. They were feeling as if they didn't belong. They were feeling as if the Messiah had not come. They were feeling as if their time had been wasted, but now they have a sense of belonging. And then, of course, we get the commissioning of Peter. Peter, who has denied Christ 3 times around the fire on the morning after Jesus is crucified on the cross, now has a conversation with Jesus in which he is forgiven. And you will remember that the Greek words that are used to describe that conversation have Jesus asking for a love that Peter can't quite give. Peter offers a love that is a little more clinging, a little more grasping than the love Jesus requests. This is a difference between agape and either eros or philios, depending on your translation in the Greek. They are literally different words in the ancient texts. The whole exchange reminds me of Mary Magdalene's engagement with Christ in the garden in that first experience. Once she recognized Jesus, once she is overwhelmed by his presence, she wants to hug him, to cling to him, to bring him close. And so does Peter. It's the same feeling, I think, reasonable, to be expected. And Jesus meets Peter there. In the last exchange, there are 3 of them, of course, as if to undo each of the 3 denials that Peter had offered before. Finally, in the last, Jesus uses the same word that Peter had been using. What did Peter need from Jesus? He needed Jesus to meet him there in the clinging love that he could offer. And Jesus did. And it was from there that Peter goes on to become the first pope. Here's a picture of Peter with the keys to the kingdom, which you will remember he is granted. And it is Peter who becomes a leader in the church in Jerusalem. Peter who has shown up all of those times in all of those stories, being the one who did what many of us couldn't find the courage to do, and being the one who had to deal with being wrong, and being wrong in a very public way. But as I mentioned last week, it is that character, that initiative, that courage to stand up and show up and be counted each and every time, which I think makes Peter the leader that he becomes, which makes Peter the one who was crucified upside down at the end, because he didn't deem himself to be worthy of being crucified upright, as was his Lord. So here's the last reflection before we have a general question and answer. When has your being forgiven been the thing that allowed you to accept the part of you that did whatever you did? Let me read that again. When you were forgiven, was that the thing that allowed you to accept the part of you that did what you did, that brought it up, shone light on it, and allowed you to integrate it into who you are? All right, I invite you back from that reflection. And again, I want you to see what we're building. If we started with the question, who do you say that I am? We're looking at each of the resurrection appearances and seeing how Jesus appeared. Was it recognized? and yet engaged in a way that gave each of the disciples, Mary, Thomas, the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and Peter and the disciples in the boat, what they needed to take the next step along their path of transformation, which was to end where Jesus then was, which was to end as resting in God and being able to see how God works in and through all things. Yeah, don't do that. Before we go to the next part then, I'd like to ask if you have any questions or reflections or comments. I specifically didn't ask for reports after our various reflections because I wanted you to have the freedom to explore as deeply and eminently as you wanted. But as we have gone through all of these appearances, I wonder if you have any questions or comments. If you do, simply look on the bottom of your screen and raise your hand electronically. Dan, the giver of all good gifts, will recognize you and unmute you so that you can speak.
All right, a couple of hands going up. Harris Allen. Harris, I'm going to allow you to talk, and you'll need to unmute yourself, and then you'll be in.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, George.
Good morning.
Question for you. What is your thinking about how we celebrate or can best celebrate the Eucharist when in this age of COVID-19, when physical distance has to be maintained?
Thank you, Harris. That's an excellent question and one that has been debated repeatedly. I think that the answer to your question is not in an interpretation of rules, whether the consecration covers elements at home that may be on your table, but instead the recognition that our communion lies in our being together, and the blessing that is being offered by the celebrant is a blessing of our life together and the presence of God in it. And to start there with what may seem loose and ambiguous is the right place to start, and then look for the presence of God and discover when it's there. It's the presence of God that is important, not strict adherence to rules. And I think if you watch the way we are celebrating the Eucharist, you'll see that we're trying to make room for that. We're trying not to violate those rules of liturgical orthodoxy, which have been developed for good reason over time, but to draw the circle wider, if you will, and include other ways that we might get the sense of belonging that the disciples had around the beach. So what I'm trying to say is I think the answer to how we commune in this shelter-in-place season doesn't lie in the interpretation of the rules of the Eucharist, but in searching for ways that we experience the presence of God together. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Excuse me, I was muted. Bonnie Lamberth, you're all set. Bonnie, if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, my answer goes along with what has just been said, in that theologically, we are the body of Christ. I mean, the body of all the believers who are gathered, and we receive the body of Christ in communion. And I was thinking about all the times I've been in dark places, and I've lived a long time since the Depression, and I've been in many dark places, but always it was the body of Christ in someone in the church who has called me out of that darkness into light. And so I see the presence of Christ often, and most often, in those people with whom I share the church experience, and they come to me in very different ways, but often call me into the light.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Jerry Darnell, if you could unmute yourself.
Hi, everybody. How are you this morning? I was wondering, why is it so hard to forgive ourselves when we can forgive others so easily?
What a great question. I suspect there are as many answers as there are people watching, but I'll give you my answer. I was perfect already. So to forgive myself requires some acknowledgement that I was imperfect. And that's sometimes hard, which is exactly why I think sometimes being forgiven by others is so important. It's often that which allows me to bring whatever element of the dark side that seems to capture me at that moment into the light, to use Bonnie's wonderful image. And I think that's what it is for me. It's the path of transformation, to get back into the language I was using. The way forward is often to recognize who you really are. That's what humility is, I think, a recognizing of who you really are. And I really am that person who was selfish or mean or childish, like Thomas was, in my view. Like, that's really me. But I'd rather that not be me. And I'm not sure you're really going to accept me if you knew that was me. So I think that's part of the struggle. I think that's part of why shadow work is so important. It's an excellent question. And I would invite others to offer their own answers. This is a good question.
Thank you, Jerry. Are there, I don't see other hands up, but others who have questions? Randy Allen. Randy, I'll allow you to talk. You can unmute yourself.
Yes, I've always been interested in the story about the Emmaus Road, and I just wanted to know if you had any opinion or insight into why Jesus didn't allow them to recognize him until the very end.
What a great question. You know, of course, I have an opinion, so here it is, but I want this to be clear that it's my opinion and not a doctrinally correct answer. If you think about the path of transformation that I've been describing, I think the movement from one stage or level to the next occurs when we have some sense, we individually have some sense that there is more and we are yearning for it. And that's what motivates us to do whatever we've got to do. To Jerry's point, maybe it's forgiving ourselves. And whatever we need to do, the motivating force, the energy behind our efforts is really that yearning to get to the next level, to experience God in a deeper way. So I would say that I think Jesus was appearing to them in a certain way, right? And they had to recognize him. It wasn't to recognize him as the other Jesus would have let them to go back to their own messianic expectations. But it was the new creation Jesus was ushering in. It was the new person that Jesus was trying to persuade them to be. And I think he gave them what they needed in order to get there. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I think each of these things,
Makes perfect
Jesus gave them what they needed.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ramsey Brewer has his hand up. Ramsey, you can unmute yourself.
This is actually Lions Brewer. I'm using Ramsey's laptop, so
I thought it might be.
that's all right.
Hello, Lions. Hello, Ramsey.
Hello. He did go to church. Anyway,
Yeah.
My impression of all this is sort of a comprehensive comment, which is what's really happening is that, you know, God and Jesus are constantly reaching out to us and constantly trying to show themselves to us so that we will follow, you know, in the way of truth. And they don't necessarily know what we're going to do with it. They don't know how we're going to respond. So that's what I see as just constant ways of whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, just constantly showing themselves and frankly being constantly misunderstood. But they keep coming back, which is the good message for all of us.
Well, Lyons, my reaction is exactly. All right, Dan, if you don't see more raised hands, I'm gonna, there may be a couple more. We have plenty, we have some time.
Yeah, we do have one more. Bill Gray. Bill.
Hi, George. I think listening to this also, the most powerful piece that spoke to me was the discussion around the road to Emmaus. The comment you made around what was it that Jesus said to them? Because you're right, we don't know what he said. And I started to reflect on the fact that there are times that things are said or there are experiences that I've had that have got my heart burning, to use the analogy that you used, that creates that recognition and that small change that makes that transformation of positivity in how I feel and how I act. And it got me thinking on that point you were making around if it's so variable as to what it could be, it reinforces that idea that God's presence can be in anything, because it's so variable. As I started to reflect on, it can be in my kid, it's something my kids did. It could be something that someone does when I'm at the ticket counter at the airport. It could be in the weather. It could be, it's so many little things that can sometimes create that feeling that it kind of really spoke to me about that idea of God's presence being everywhere. So I found that section kind of really linked all of the four aspects of Keating's transformational experience together for me. And I think that might be a really good place to deepen that thought as I go through this week.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you, Bill. You reminded me of something about myself that I'm going to share quickly. And that is, those of you who know me know I'm prone to getting sucked up into some project. So I'll find some thought, some theory, and that's all I can think about and all I can read about and all you hear about, because that's what I'm going to teach about next. And I'm laughing because I'm remembering how many times in my life I thought, this is what Jesus said to the disciples on the road. And I think I was right each of those times in a way. See where I'm going? It's like the mystery of God is that we will never fully understand it. We can only live more deeply into it. And so each time we catch a sense of what the true presence of God is, I think that's what we hear from Jesus on the road. And then if we continue to grow, we continue to deepen, and we continue to see how that thing isn't really it, because it can't be described so precisely. It's part of something larger. And I think I've grown through my own, in retrospect, laughable devotion to these different answers over time. And together I can see a broadening. I wasn't wrong, except to the extent I thought that was it. So I love, Bill, the way you're taking that as kind of a perspective to go through Holy Week. That sounds perfect to me. All right. One more question, maybe?
Yes, Harris Allen again. Harris, you are on.
Thank you for taking this one more question from me, George. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
You know, I tell you something, this is really on point for me this morning specifically. And I'd like to share that I've been working on a piece that is going to eventually be an opinion piece published. And it has to do with the importance of evolving with our respect to the messaging around social distancing. It really isn't social distance itself that really is being called upon here. It is physical distance combined with forging new ways of social connection. And this discussion this morning is very rich for me. You know, it's interesting. I just tuned into this session right as you were talking. I tried to get on at the beginning, but I couldn't figure it out, right? So I got on right as you were talking about the disciples in the road to Emmaus and how Jesus sort of appeared to them and didn't become clear. It didn't become clear who he was until well into that exchange in that episode. And your comment about how this was like Christ at that point, shepherding, helping to shepherd the transformation, right? Well, what's happening now in this period of COVID-19, right? Perhaps it's God's way of setting up a further transformation for us as human beings about fostering social connection in ways that move beyond physical proximity, the need to be in physical proximity. Perhaps it's about the business of learning how to share and celebrate the Eucharist in new and different ways that go beyond physical distancing. I think this is extraordinarily rich, and I want to thank you for it.
Well, thank you, Harris. That's a wonderful perspective, and I look forward to your piece. And it provides a wonderful segue to what I want to offer you next. Because of our time, I'm going to let this serve as our closing prayer and invite you, when it's all over, just to sit with it for a moment and think about how it brings us into communion, to borrow Harris's perspective, and how it reminds us of the presence of Christ, and how it might, for you, as it does for me, give us some of what we need to see Jesus right now. Have a wonderful Palm Sunday. I look forward to seeing and hearing and being with you during Holy Week.
What keys are in, Robbie? F demented.
Pulled into Nazareth, I was feeling about half past dead. Just need some place where I could lay my head. Hey, mister, can you tell me where a man might find a bed? He just grinned and shook my hand. You know what's all he said. Take a load off Daddy. Take a load for free. Take a load off Daddy. and looking for a place to hide. When I saw old Garment and the devil walking side by side, say, hey, come on, let's go downtown. She said, I gotta go, but my friend can stick around. Take a load off, baby. Take a load for free. Take a load off, baby. And put the load around me. Go down, Miss Moses. There ain't nothing you can say. Just so Luke, and Luke's waiting on Judgment Day. Well, Luke, my friend, what about young Annalie? Said, do me a favor, son, won't you stay and keep Annalie company? Take a load off Annie, take a load for free. Take a load off Annie. Chester followed me and he caught me in the fog. He said, I will fix your act if you'll take Jack, my dog. I said, wait a minute, Chester, no, I'm a peaceful man. He said, that's okay, boy, won't you feed him when you can. Take a load off Fanny, take a load for free. Take a load off Fanny. Hey, put the load right on me.
Catch a cannonball now to take me down the line. My bag is sinking low, and I do believe it's time to get back to Miss Fanny. You know